People come to the knowledge of God in so many different ways. Today, I had an amazing interview with my friend Dave. Most of you know him as Dopey, and he shared how he found his faith in God through recovery. Watch it here. Coming all the way from New York.
Yes.
Um, so let's talk just like a little bit of a background. Now, did you grow up in any kind of faith?
Well, I grew up in 100% Jewish household, but there was no faith and there was no God, but there was a lot of cultural um stuff. Like I went to Hebrew school, we celebrated all the holidays, like we would do that every year. But it's interesting because all the holidays in Judaism kind of exalt God. You know, God is the center, but in American Judaism, often it's not about God. It's really about cultural family, it's about tradition more than it is about God. Um, I mean, and I want that's my experience. Like, I grew up in New York City, with a lot of kind of secular Jews who did the holidays, but God was not like the thing, like God was not the thing in my family or in any of my friends' families. And I actually I didn't find God until I needed God, So like and even in religious school, there was very little God in my
Really? So
in my in my experience.
what
Yes.
is Hebrew school like? Like, did they teach you Hebrew?
Yeah, well, again, I just wanna say this, I'm a horrible student. I went to Hebrew school, like, 1 afternoon a week or something, and I was not interested in learning anything. So anything that I say could definitely not be true. It could totally just be based on my recollection, and I also am a horrible drug addict, and I've taken a lot of drugs that have fucked up my recollecting ability. But in my recollection, what we learned in Hebrew school was, first of all, Hebrew has different letters, right? Different characters than English. So the first thing you learn is the alphabet. And then you kind of learn how to read. But in my Hebrew school, there was very, very little vocabulary. So you could read, and I was never a good Hebrew reader either. You could read, but you didn't know what you were saying. You were kind of, you knew a couple words. You knew mother, father, like God. You knew a couple of words, and then there was a lot of talk about, and it's funny because it's such a horrible time for Israel right now, and such a
Mhm.
horrible time for Jewish people in a lot of ways. But it was a lot of just like Zionist propaganda, like about how, like, I remember learning a lot about like how one Israeli tank was better than 20 Jordanian tanks. Like, it was weird shit. It was also about how new settlers in Israel, like how they irrigated it and how they built up these cities, and just real pro Israel. That was mostly it. It was Jewish holidays, a lot of Jewish songs, which I loved, holiday songs, um, learning how to read Hebrew, the also just a lot of fear stuff because our people were so decimated so many times over history, and so many Jewish people in New York City were descended from Holocaust survivors and family members who didn't survive. There was a lot of Holocaust stuff and a lot of like fear, like we're gonna get killed, everybody wants to kill us kind of thing.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, especially, things going on in the world today. I mean, we are constantly praying for Israel, like every day. So,
Well, it's tricky, and it's to come from a people that were kind of hated and persecuted throughout history, but then the tenet of Judaism is that Jews are the chosen people. It creates this weird, scary duality that it never really made sense to me. Like, I liked the idea of all people being equal,
all right.
And
So we were talking about the things that you learned in school and about your mom and dad, um, but that you did not have like you had like a lot of knowledge and you knew a lot about culture, but you were not exposed to any kind of like faith or personal relationship.
Yeah, zero faith, maybe even negative faith. Like because in the world there's so much like discord and animosity and hatred between people. My father was and my mother were very much like, if all these people in the world are using God as an excuse to hate each other, then maybe we don't want to have anything to do with that. Not recognizing the idea of God as some universal force or binding property, but more like the thing that separates people. So like God was more like the everybody believes in a different God, and those different gods keep people apart. So why don't we just remove God from our conversation? And that's kind of the way I grew up. And my dad is like, I mean, he gets angry when I say he hates God, but he doesn't like the concept. He thinks it's more divisive than it is inclusive, and he doesn't talk. He's not interested in talking about the nature of reality and like the spiritual nature of reality. He's also like he grew up like I said, he grew up very religious, and then he got very interested in science, and he wanted to be a pharmacist. He wound up becoming a science teacher. So his God is definitely science, which in his mind is the enemy of God.
Yeah, scientific people are the hardest to to share faith with, I found.
Well, my faith is not, it's not like, my faith is more in tune with science and nature and just sort of like my experience of faith in God is more like, in the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous it says God is everything or God is nothing. And there's a lot of ways to examine that phrase. And the way I've always examined, or the way I've learned to examine it, I guess, is that God is everything, meaning from here to infinity, it's all God. You know, like, which means God is the ocean, God are the whales, God is you, God is me, God is the sky. God, in my conception of God, God isn't making a decision for me. God is the reality of what happens. So when I do the next right thing, like, I don't think God favors the next right thing versus, fucking everything up. I think that's just the nature of reality. I think the next right thing comes into play where I benefit from it, you benefit from it, the world benefits from it, and that's a nice feeling. But God doesn't stop natural disasters. God doesn't stop war. And I don't think, in my perception, this is just my perception, it's not like there's, and if there is a consciousness, right, I don't understand it. I don't understand like this overarching narrative of why God's will would have so much terror and crazy shit in it. So the way I look at it instead is God is the binding force of all reality and existence, and I want to be on the nice side of that.
Well, that's a good choice for free will for sure.
You know what I mean?
Yeah. So when did you become open to a concept of God?
I think it's ironic. I think when I started doing drugs in the first place, I was really into rock and roll. I was really into kind of old school. Like there was a movement, like a movement in American writing called the Beat Writers, where they wrote about like rebels and spirituality and like just exciting fucking weirdo shit. And I got into that. And I guess when I first started smoking weed, or I first started taking psychedelics, and I was interested in like the Beatles and Bob Dylan and this concept of spirituality. So I kind of like crept in that way. And I had this experience, like I was very interested in tapping into a different reality, because I also like I grew up on the 21st floor of an apartment building of like middle class, working class housing, low income housing, and I grew up in front of a television and I ate frozen pizza, and I was like very much like raised by a TV. You know what I mean? Like watching sitcoms. So like when the idea of spirituality through music and through experience became something to me, I was like, oh, this is really cool. I want to be like that. And I started taking drugs and I started getting more in touch with this far out idea. And I remember it very well. I think it was the summer of 1995, and I had an internship at a place in Manhattan called the International Center of Photography, which was on the Upper East Side. And I grew up in Chelsea. I lived in Chelsea, which is like kind of diagonally across the island of Manhattan. And to get there, and I love walking, and to get there, you can walk diagonally through Central Park, which is really beautiful and really big. And there's a place in the middle of Central Park called Sheep's Meadow. And Sheep's Meadow is like a big field where all these people kind of like sunbathe, and there's a bunch of hippies, and there's a bunch of like, it's beautiful. It's a very, very specific place in New York City. And at the time, it was the mid 90s where this retro hippie shit was kind of coming back. And a lot of people smoked weed in the park. A lot of people sold acid in the park. And there was a lady who sold spiritual texts. Like she had like a Hindu book. She had the all these spiritual texts. I can't think of the names of them right now. But like the Bhagavad Gita or whatever it's called, like all these spiritual books. And I was also in school, like I was getting high, and I was supposed to study TV in school, but then I started getting high and I was like, I'm going to study art history. And then in art history, I started learning about Eastern art, and I was like, this is so interesting. It just tapped into something. And then I started studying a little bit of Eastern religion, and then I started studying primal religion, and it all was just interesting to me. So I met this lady in the park. She was a black lady who wore like a headscarf, and she had all these books of all these different faiths. There was probably a Christian book. There was probably a Jewish book. There was definitely a bunch of weirdo Eastern books. And I started talking to her because I was, having fun and young and whatever. And she told me her name was Seharaki, and she had all these texts, and I was very interested in like, why was she selling all these multi-faith texts? And she said, I'm a universal spiritual person in love. And I was like, wow, that's beautiful. I was like, I really was, I mean, I don't remember fucking anything from my life, but for some reason that really spoke to me. And I wanted to be that. Did I become that? No. I tried to. I got into like hippie shit and I didn't really do it, and I became a total drug addict instead. And I wound up addicted to heroin for, I don't know, 12, 13 years. I was on and off methadone. My spiritual life became the size of a speck. And it was always in the back of my head. And every time I'd go to rehab, they would talk about spirituality, and it was not, I didn't care. All I really wanted to do was be high. And we had a kid. I met a woman. We had a kid. There was no spirituality. There was just nothing there because I was so enamored with getting high.
Right. So like your heroin was your God.
Yeah, heroin gave me everything I wanted. But I also I loved cigarettes. I loved weed. I loved TV. I loved ice cream. I was a hedonist, like big time hedonist. And I would still be a big time hedonist if I could live that way. I just couldn't live that way. I didn't get exposed to God until I got sober, is really the answer.
And so that came through the big book, or came through working steps?
Basically, like I did Narcotics Anonymous and I didn't do it. Like I just didn't care. I just was trying to figure out how I could get high. Maybe I got 6 months, had a drink, didn't tell anybody, whatever. And it wasn't until like I got sober, and I didn't know that I was getting sober. I just got a day and I found a meeting, and I heard, I think my first profound spiritual moment in my late life happened when I was 41, and it was the first time I heard them read How It Works in an AA meeting, which said, rarely had we seen someone thoroughly follow our path and not achieve these results. And I was so desperate, and I heard thoroughly follow this path. So what did thoroughly follow this path mean? It meant you needed to find a higher power. And I wanted a higher power so badly. And, you'd hear people in 12 steps saying, like, you can use a doorknob. And it's like, what are you fucking talking about? Like, what is that? What is that?
That always baffled me.
Right. But I was messed up. You know what I mean? Like, I was
Right.
not in a good way when I got there. And there was an old guy, and he said, well, do you have a gift of desperation? And I'd never heard that before. Do you have a gift of desperation? And I was really, really desperate. And I said, yes, I have a gift of desperation. And he said, well, that's your GOD then. Use that. And I heard group of drunks, and I heard group of drug addicts. And then later I heard great outdoors. And I was like, gift of desperation was my entry place. And then I had a lot of resentments. I was separated from my partner and our daughter, and I was really angry about it. So someone said, you need to pray for her every day. And I was like, I don't even know how to pray. I have no idea. And they said, well, what they instructed me was to say, God, give this person all the love and compassion that you're freely given. And I said, and I was desperate, and I wanted to feel better, so I did it. And then it was, do you pray every morning? And I said, I don't know what to say. And they said, God, help me. I mean, my current sponsor said, say, God, show me the path. Keep me, and then help me do the next right thing, and then help me remove my character defects, and then anything that's kind of in my way, I can pray for. Help me not be so angry, help me not be so selfish, help me think of other people. And then there's like the third step prayer, and take my will and whatever. I used to know all these prayers, that now I just say, God, help me, put me on the path, and show me the thing. I say it in different ways every morning, but it's really just about reminding myself that it's not me, that there's something much bigger and much more beautiful and inclusive that I can hand over my will to. And I also hated that. Turn your will over. I was like, what are you talking about? Turn your will over. There's a guy at my meeting who always says he learned how to surrender because he was losing, and he was like, I'm going to surrender to the winning side. And I liked that. It's hard. I think to become spiritual. I mean, I just celebrated 9 years of recovery, and I'm just almost comfortable with saying that I'm spiritual. And then the it's like whenever I'm struggling in my recovery, it says it's a spiritual program. So the only way if you're doing 12-step, and I am doing 12-step, you need to find a way to be spiritual. And then it's like, well, what is spiritual? And it's like praying, meditating, talking about God, trying to help others. It's like, and then all of a sudden, if you're doing those things, you are spiritual.
Mm-hmm. So was your issue with handing things over, your will in your life, your thoughts and your actions over to this care of God, was it hard because you weren't sure how God felt about you because of, your upbringing and the things you saw in the world?
I don't think I have a feeling that God feels anything. God is just kind of there. You know what I mean? It was more like, it's so weird to unpack because I grew up where God wasn't a thing. God, like, only, and this might offend you, but the way I grew up was like, my dad was like, only idiots believe in God, and then when I got sober because of God. And it's like, it created this weird kind of duality. So I don't believe in God in the kind of magic way, but at the same time, it is all magic. It's like it goes both ways at the exact same time. I never consider how God feels about me. I more consider am I willing, what am I willing to do to have the life that I want? And if I think about that lady Saharaki, who is a universal person in love, how do I go with the flow of the universe and try to do good and try to be loving and be of service? Like, that's where God is for me. And like, can I get in that stream of goodness? You know, like everything else is, I don't care. Like, I don't give a shit about like the particulars of like who's who, whatever. Just next right thing, go with the flow. No matter what, it's going to be like, we're all here. You know what I mean? Like, there's nothing I can really do besides try to be of service. And then there's another way of saying I'm serving God when I'm of service.
Right, absolutely. And it, it says that in the Bible too. It talks about, whatever you do for one of these, you have done for me. Like, that's what God says. You know what I mean? It says like, oh, when you were in prison, you visited me. When I was hungry, you fed me. When I was, whatever, lonely, you talk to me. You know what I mean? Like, so what you're talking about, like being of service, you know what I mean? Like, so it's almost like you're like the God in you working, you know what I mean? Like helping the God in someone else, you know what I mean?
Totally. It's just so funny how we all have our path, and like how resistant, like I never read the Bible. Like, I never read the Bible, and I say it in a way that I'm almost proud of it. But in reality, I'm just resistant to a lot of stuff. And the idea of what something is like is still bigger than actually what it's like. You know? So I I'm very happy with where I got to in my spirituality, and I really do believe that it will expand if I feed it the good thing, you know. But it's funny the way, you know, there's an old parable, the old story about the blind man with the elephant, which is like all these blind men touch a different part of the elephant and they don't know what the elephant looks like because the elephant is so big and it's got this tusk and it's got this tail and it's got this trunk and it's got these floppy ears and it's got these weird feet, and we can all be touching a different part of God, but it's the same God. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that's really cool, and I just think it's cool that like even people like who have like maybe a different concept of God are still in the same, like we're all still in the same line, of like our beliefs and like what we do, you know what I mean, as far as like serving others and like doing good, especially people in recovery that I found.
That's where like it's beautiful. Like when it's God, like your God thinks this and my God thinks this and you're going to hell and you suck, and that's where it like becomes like, no, I don't want to have anything to do with that. But I want to have something to do with the God that's kind and loving. And that's the other thing my sponsor always says, that he was raised Christian, but he says that his God is just love and that he understands love like what's the word? Unconditional love, like that you feel for maybe your child or your family or whatever. It's like that feeling is so powerful, like that's something to align yourself with. And I mean, I believe in God, like, and connection, like in a way that you and I are not in the same room, but we can connect, and it's more than just hearing and thinking. It's like it's a deeper level, and I don't know. I think the world is so connected. Or then all those cool, really weird, cool psychedelic things, like the lungs look exactly like a tree without leaves, and the tree is providing oxygen, and the lungs are taking it in, and all that weird psychedelic shit. It's all gone,
It's very interesting, yeah.
you know.
Yeah, well, that's super cool. So, do you have any advice that you would give to someone who, is resistant to being open to having something, a higher power?
Definitely, it's because I am resistant. Like I've been resistant my whole life, and being open and willing has given me like the greatest gift I ever got. Basically, did you ever see the movie The Matrix?
A long time ago, yeah.
There's a scene in The Matrix where Neo, who is Keanu Reeves, is in the back seat of a car and he doesn't believe that the Matrix exists. And the people in the car said, you know, open the door, look down the street. You've been down that street a million times and you know exactly what is there. What happens if you try something else? Like, what do you have to lose? It's like, especially people who are resistant and struggling with drugs or
Yeah.
alcohol. It's like, okay, like, don't be willing. I mean, but then the other thing is like, we can't do anything for anybody except like be like, this worked for me, good luck, hope, and I'm here for you if you need anything. But I mean, I would say you can always go back to your old thinking. You can always go back to, you know, being alone, you know, and being miserable and alone. Or you can be like, I'm open to experience. I'm open to love. And the more I put into this world of generosity and kindness, it's funny because it can start in this place where you're like, fuck that. I don't want to talk about religion or this thing or God as this thing. But if you unpack it to just good forces of kindness, love, service, generosity, openness, it's like, how can anybody refute it? So like that's what I really encourage to anybody who's resistant. If you're resistant and you're having the best life of your life, then keep doing what you're doing. It's working. But if you're resistant and you're miserable and you're stuck and you're struggling, then like, what do you have to lose?
Absolutely. Yeah.